Hello, welcome. Was a lovely turnout. I'm Simon White. I'm going to talk about managing the risk of change. Can you hear me all right? That's good. So thank you for coming. I'll tell you a little bit about myself first. I'm a risk management consultant. You can read all that later. Typically, I go into a project and I help them do a risk assessment. And that includes run a risk workshop, ask them to talk about their risk, think about ways in which the project might not go as planned, either on schedule or cost. And then typically afterwards, I build a probabilistic model which helps them understand the logical effect of all those risks. I work a lot in oil and gas. They do this a lot. All their projects, drilling for oil in the North Sea, have to go through a risk assessment before they get approval. So approval of the project is based on not just the baseline schedule and the apparent first gas date or first oil date and the associated cost with that, but also a risked expression of that. And they use these phrases P10, P50, P90. And these are, as I say, risked versions of the schedule of the first oil or first gas date and of the cost. I guess my approach tries to make this very practical and very transparent so that the project team who were in the risk workshop talking about the risks and talking about how likely they were to happen and what would be the impact if they happened, those people, when they see the report at the end, they recognize what they said. And so they feel that the risk analysis and ultimately the P90 cost is a good reflection of the risk that they genuinely believe to be in reality of the project. Today, I'm going to talk about an experience I had with one of my customers where I was lucky enough to be involved in not a typical project where you spend money to get to a point where you deliver something, but to a change program. And I'm going to talk about that. Along the way, I'm going to introduce, I'm sorry for the microphone technique. Along the way, I'm going to introduce some terms which you've probably come across if you're in the project world, which I'm going to try and demystify. So terms like probability, three-point estimate, impact, exposure, contingency, mitigation, probability distribution, and as I said, the P10, P50, P90. Who here could describe, I'm not going to ask you, but who feels that you could describe what is a P90? Raise your hand if you could. Yeah, quite a few of you. Quite a few of you not comfortable with, or don't know what it is, or perhaps not comfortable with saying what it is. So I hope to give you the knowledge of that. So let's talk about change. I Googled change. So I typed change is, and Google suggested lots of things. Change is coming. Change is good. Change is gonna come. Change is the only constant, which is very deep, very profound. And change is inevitable, which is also quite profound. So it's all these things, but is it risky? Is change risky? Well, I typed the letter R to see if Google would say risky, but it said change is required. Change is really coming. Change is relative. Change is a rule of life. Change is reflected, which is so deep I have no idea what it means. But of course, change is risky. I looked through some literature on change management, and there's some very famous graphs and pictures such as this one, 8 steps to successful change. You may have seen this. And I noticed that one of the first step is establishing a sense of urgency. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Some other literature that I saw compares the project management life cycle with the change management life cycle. And I noticed that in the change management life cycle, we have these steps at the beginning, at the end. We have prepare, and then we manage like a project, and then we reinforce. So I also noticed that somebody's perception of the competencies required of a change manager as opposed to a project manager, and I noticed that the change manager needs to look at analysis and assessment and action orientation. And these are relevant things which, my job normally is working in projects. And so these are the things I noticed as being different when I was working on a change program. And the upshot of all my research was, and this is my picture, this is the way I see it, is that I see that change management is wider than the act of project management, because not only does it talk about planning, executing, and managing the work, but change management also talks about why are we doing it. So the benefits, what's the point of doing this project? Understanding the impact of doing this change program, perhaps managing resistance, reinforcing the change afterwards, and action orientation. So this is my summary of the literature of the research that I did in change management before I did this work. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about, now if we talked about what is change, I'll talk a little bit about managing the risk of change. So, in my view, risk can prevent the benefits of a change program being realized. Risk can add unanticipated costs, delays, or other problems, as in a typical project. And risk might prevent the change from being accepted by the wider organization. I noticed that in change management, people do talk about risk matrices, which was very familiar to me and would be familiar to you if you've ever been in a risk workshop. And they talk about there in the middle there, the likelihood consequence matrix, which many of you might have seen before. And it comes up a lot. There's another one. I'm going to skip through these. There's another one. Notice, actually, on this one, the probability is along the bottom, and the impact is up the side. I prefer this one, where the probability is up the side and the impact is along the bottom. And you'll see why that is in one of my pictures that I show shortly. So lots of matrices. People use risk matrices. So that's a commonality between what I did and what I was being asked to do by this customer. So I'd like now to talk about risk assessment in my world. So I see risk assessment as being three parts. Risk assessment, which is saying what do we believe about the risk to this project or change program. Risk analysis, which is asking, given the risk that we believe exists, what does it mean on the overall project? And then risk awareness. I had to use an A, just because we like alliteration. So awareness being, given that the risk exists and given that we know what it means on the overall project, what should we do about it? So I'm going to talk about those things quickly before I talk about the change program that I worked on. So there are two popular ways of expressing risk. You'll recognize this risk matrix again. And this is a probability and an impact of a risk. There's a chance that something might happen, like contractor issues, and there's an impact if it does. And we typically rank our risks, and we say, how big is the probability on a scale of 1 to 5? And we say, how big is the impact on a scale of 1 to 5? So that's one of the ways. Another way we have of expressing risk is the three-point estimate. So a three-point estimate is where we say, here's some part of my project. In this case, it's the cost of a particular activity, or it could be the duration of an activity. And we've said perhaps it's going to be 6 million, but we know that there is some uncertainty around that. And a three-point estimate is really how we express what we do know. So we're recognizing that we don't know exactly how much it's going to cost, but the three-point estimate allows us to say, well, we know it's not going to be more than 11 million, and we know it's not going to be less than 4 million. And so it puts some bounds around it, and it allows us to put a range around what it could possibly be. This could be based on gut feel, could be based on experience of other projects, could be based on data from other projects. But this is really us just expressing our beliefs about the project, and I'll show you how we use this to do our risk assessment. And here you'll see the P10, P50, P90, which I'm going to talk about in more detail shortly. So, given these two ways we have of expressing risk, what can we do about it? What can we do with it, sorry? So imagine we have two projects, and we're choosing between the two. And the two projects are baselined with a schedule, and they have a cost estimate against them. And Project A finishes on the 9th of September, and Project B finishes slightly later, 14th of October. So you might say Project A is better. Let's go for Project A instead of Project B. Project A also turns out on paper to be cheaper. That number is 800, whereas Project B is 900. But very often I get called into a project, perhaps at the stage of concept selection, where they're trying to make this choice, and the team are aware that this isn't the whole story. Because while Project A might look cheaper and quicker in its base version, in its deterministic version, you could say, they might also feel that the two projects suffer from different levels of risk. For example, we think that Project A is more risky because it's been never been done before. Perhaps we think Project A is more risky because it's challenging conditions, whereas Project B is easy conditions. Project B, perhaps all the regulations are well established, whereas Project A has some uncertain regulations which are going to add risk. And Project A might be in an early phase, Project B might be mid-execution, another reason for why Project B might be less risky. And so I see risk assessment using the two techniques that I've just shown you as a way of turning these verbal, qualitative, kind of wordy feeling descriptions into some numbers that we can do something with. And what we do is we express our beliefs. That's an odd picture. We express our beliefs using three-point estimates. So here I have a triangle against perhaps the duration of my design phase of the project, and that expresses the uncertainty we feel that exists around that phase. And I have a triangle here, it's meant to be a triangle anyway, about the design phase on Project B, and it's meant to be narrower to indicate that we feel there's less risk on Project B. And perhaps we have risk register, where we have a risk which could affect the design phase. Perhaps the risk would be technological issues or contractor issues, whatever reason we feel could push up the design phase duration. And that risk is bigger on Project A than it is on Project B. So I don't know if you can see, but the risk is sitting in the black zone, high probability, high impact on design phase A, and it's lower probability, lower impact on Project B. And so with these expressions of risk, uncertainty, it's all the same thing, it's risk. With these expressions of risk, we can ask, well, what does that do to the overall finish date and cost of the projects? And risk analysis really is nothing more than the mathematical process of asking that question. So given these expressions of risk and uncertainty against the two versions of the project, I can say Project B is therefore less risky because the range of possible outcomes of its finish date is narrower for Project B than it is for Project A. So risk assessment is a way of quantifying and perhaps solidifying or formalizing our beliefs. And we know, with the project team, we know about this project. We know those contractors and we know those technical conditions that the project's operating under. Our beliefs matter. And it's a way of formalizing those beliefs and turning them into numbers that we can use to make good decisions. And turning those words, cheaper but more risky, into numbers is really, really worthwhile. So what do you need to do a risk assessment? All you really need, and I'm talking about projects now, not particularly change programs. All you need is a base estimate, quite high level. I recommend about 20 to 50 line items of your cost estimate. A base schedule, so that your work breakdown structure, your WBS. Again, high level. I recommend around 300 is probably getting on the detailed side of the kind of level of detail that you want to be discussing and modeling your risk. Allowances and contingencies identified, good forward-driven logic in your schedule, so no constraints unless they really exist, but have activities driven by preceding activities with finish to start logic. And any risks that you've already identified. And what we do is we quantify our risks. So for each risk, we ask how likely is it to happen, and what would be the impact if it does happen. And we ask the impact on cost and the impact on schedule. And the impact is, if it occurs, then it would cost us 500,000 to $1 million. If it occurs, it would cost us between 2 and 4 weeks. And we give this as a range, the impact. We don't know exactly what the impact is going to be. So we say if the risk happens, the best case is 2 weeks delay, the worst case, 4 weeks delay. And I can give a middle one as well, most likely 3 weeks delay. So here I'm using this P10, P50, P90 again. And I'd like you to see the P10, P50, P90 as best case, or almost not really best case, but reasonable best case. P50 is your kind of average, perhaps the sort of the case which you've equal chance of going over as going under, and the P90, your worst case, or almost worst case. I've got some pictures where I can show why it's not the absolute worst case. So we quantify our risks in this way. And then we associate the risks with items in our estimates. So associate your risk. If this risk happens, it's going to be the lift vessel arrival. It's going to be the risk is delay to the lift vessel arriving to lift our oil rig, my background's oil and gas, to lift the oil rig from the barge onto the legs in the middle of the sea. And if that risk happens, if that big crane vessel is delayed, there's not very many of them in the world, so it does happen, it's a real risk. If it happens, it will impact our installation activities where we're installing the platform. So we're associating our risks with line items in the schedule. We also associate our risks with line items in the cost estimate. So if this vessel is delayed, we're going to be paying people waiting around, paying barges to wait around for this thing to arrive. That's going to cost us money. And it's going to be the topsides cost which is going to go up if that happens. So you probably already have a risk register for your project, and you've probably already expressed some kind of probability and impact of your risks on a matrix. And all I'm asking is that you quantify those risks. So you turn your probability from, your typical matrix is like high, medium, or low probability, or rare, has been known, medium, high probability, or likely, very likely. People use words as well as numbers. What I'm asking is that you quantify it instead. So say this risk has a 25% chance of happening. And we don't get too focused about what the actual exact number is. I usually stick to round it to 5%. So 25%, 30% is all right, but 27%, if we're into that level of conversation, don't worry about it. It really doesn't matter. What matters is it 50% or is it 2%? That's the kind of level at which we should be talking about the probability of our risk. And again, the impact, quantify that as well. And actually, you don't even need to quantify your risks. I typically, for a project, wants a quick, practical, but meaningful risk assessment. I'll go with the definitions that they have in their risk register. So typically, a project will say, if you think a risk is, the impact is more than 5% of the overall project budget, then that's when you should give it a high impact. If you think it's less than, between 1 and 2%, give it a medium. So they often have these scales defined already, and we can just use those. So I'm trying to give the idea, I guess, that taking a qualitative risk assessment, like a risk register, into I can't remember what I said, taking a qualitative risk assessment into a quantitative risk assessment shouldn't be too painful, and you don't really need that much more information. Now I'd like to just define what is a risk. So my definition, there are lots of definitions of a risk, and I say simply a risk is anything which could cause our project to deviate from its base assumptions. So a risk is anything that could cause the project to deviate from what we've said will happen in our base estimates, schedule and cost. It's a very easy definition, and it's very useful. And it may or may not happen. Some risks will happen, some risks may or may not happen. And I'd like to look at the idea of probability. So when we talk about a risk, how likely is it and what is the impact? It's very useful to visualize it like this. It's not too easy to read. I apologize, it's a bit faint. But what I have here is cumulative probability and outcome. So the horizontal axis is outcome. So here is a risk, which I'm saying, well, the outcome could be 0. There's this big spike here at 0, which shows me that actually that's the most likely thing to happen, is that the outcome of the risk is 0. But it might not be 0. It might happen, and it might cost us here, best case, $500,000. That's 0.5 there, that number. Worst case, 2 million. So that's the impact that we've assessed for the risk. And the probability we can read from up the side of the graph. So the vertical axis is probability. And here we're saying there is a 65% chance, that's this point here, that the risk outcome is 0. So there's a 65% chance the risk doesn't happen, and there's a correspondingly a 35% chance, which is this bit, that it does happen and costs us money. And the cost is somewhere between 0.5 going all the way up to 2. And they're evenly distributed as well, I can see by the straightness of the line. So I'm saying if it happens, any outcome between $500,000 and 2 million are equally likely. I haven't expressed anything about a most likely or anything. I'm just saying anywhere between those two extremes is equally likely to happen. The impact is that range along the bottom. That's the impact of a risk. And the probability of a risk is the point at which it starts to cost us money on the probability scale. So imagine now, I mean, this might be new to you, but I find this very useful to show to people in a risk assessment when people are talking about probability and impact. Imagine a risk which has a much bigger impact, but a much lower probability. So if you do a kind of a probability times impact calculation, which many people do, you might arrive at the same number, because the impact is higher, but the probability is lower, and it balances itself out. But that's not the full picture. What would this picture look like if I had a risk that's much less likely to happen and a much higher impact? You can probably imagine that it's like this. So here, my outcomes are much bigger. So the impact of the risk is much bigger. There's anyway, it's like 20 to 50 or 60 here. And the probability is much lower. Why? Because it's up to about 95% before the risk even happens. So much lower probability, much higher impact. Useful to think about these and think about how probability and impact sort of interact with each other using these pictures. Okay, 3-point estimates. Here's a 3-point estimate. So as well as risks, we can talk about uncertainty. We can say that I have a quantity, I showed this before. My base estimate is that the activity is going to cost 6 million, but it could be less, could be more. It can't be less than 4 million. There's no way that's going to happen. That's what we do know. Can't be more than 11. That's no way either, and we know that too. We're expressing what we know. We're using risk assessment to admit we don't know, but to express what we do know. And here, the P10, as I said, is almost your best case. It's not quite your best case, and it's useful in a risk assessment to ask somebody, instead of asking them, so what's the lowest possible cost of this activity? Or actually, let me go on the P90 side. To ask somebody what's the worst possible outcome of this activity, people start thinking about ridiculous things like terrorist incidents or aliens landing from Mars and say, well, that would push the cost up to a lot. But we don't really want them to think about those things. I'm talking about reasonable worst case. And so a reasonable worst case, we say, is this point here. And it's the P90. And I define a P90 as being, it's the outcome which, with a 90% chance that we're not going to go worse than that. There is a chance we could go worse than the P90. It's this part here. But there's only a 10% chance of that happening. Quite unlikely for it to happen. I like the P10 to P90 range because it kind of fits with the 80-20 rule that's popular. You know, we're covering, in between the P10 and P90, we're covering the 80% of probabilities. Outside of the P10 and P90 is 20%, 10% there and 10% there. People ask, why do you always talk about P10 and P90? Well, many companies don't. Many companies use P70, P50, P80. You can choose your level of risk that you're prepared to take, and you ask the right question. Okay, and what the risk analysis does, as I've said, is it takes a base estimate, takes your expressions of risk, and tells you what your overall project cost or finish date can be given all these expressions of risk. And this is a probability distribution of our total project cost, and this represents our exposure to risk of this project. Now I want to skip those because I want to talk about this actual change project. I've got 10 minutes left for some questions. So I did this project for ABP, Associated British Ports. They own a lot of ports around the coast, obviously, of the UK, and one right in the middle, which is weird, having a port in the middle of the country. It's a train terminal. So they own all these facilities, and they were running a massive change programming involving a SAP implementation, SAP, and the associated behavioral and policies and procedural change. And they asked me to do the quantitative modeling. So that was my role. And I was given the base cost of the project, of the change itself, and I was given the base estimates of the benefits that would come. And it's really the benefits, modeling benefits as well as project costs, that for me made it from a normal project risk assessment into a change program risk assessment. And I was asked to give the corresponding risk-based profit. And they used this to say, well, is this worth doing? You know, we think it's going to save us, you know, the overall benefit is going to be whatever billion it was, but with risk, is it going to be that? And is it actually worth doing? And I'd like to show you, with a very simple example, how I did it. So here's a really simple, really simple change program. We're spending some money, and then we're making some benefits from that. So this first bar here is the project. We're spending 20 million over about 9 months. And once the project's finished, we're making money back at a certain rate, and we estimated that it's going to be about 3 years of benefits that we make back, totaling 60 million. Profit, 20 million expenditure, 60 million benefits, profit is 40 million. So that's our base. But over here you can see we have some expressions of risk. So we have said, for example, that the project schedule could be shorter, 18% shorter, based on our experience, based on discussions in a risk workshop, and so on and so on and so on. It could be longer, it could be 25% longer. And we've said that actually even financially, regardless of the duration of the project, the rate at which we spend it itself is subject to some uncertainty. And we put some variance around that. 20% less could be 30% more. And we've done the same kind of thing on the benefits. And so we've said we might make money for about 3 years, but it could be longer, 15% longer, could be shorter, could be 30% shorter. And the variance around the rate at which we make money as well, which we've made an assumption, a guess, we've said that there's some plus or minus around that too. This is a really, really simple example. I'll talk about this major technical issues risk in a second. So with this expression of risk, what does risk analysis do to us? So looking at the benefits first, how long are we making money for? Looks like this. It's a triangle. I use just a triangle for my 3-point estimate. My base assumption was about 1,000 days. Could be less, could be more. And there's my P10, P90. What about the amount of money we make, this 60 million? What does that look like, given these expressions of risk? Well, that as well is a probability distribution. It's not particularly triangular. It's kind of a bit curvy. And the reason it's a bit curvy and not just a pure triangle is because it depends on two things. It depends on how long we're making the money for, and also what rate at which we're making the money, both of which have 3-point estimates around them. And it becomes useful to ask, all right, so if my contingency then is that I'm saying we're making, my base is that we make 60, but my P90 is we only make 50, where is that risk coming from? And I can see here that most of it is coming from the schedule variance of the benefits, so how long we're making the benefits for, and the rest of it is coming from the variance around the day rate, the rate at which we make benefits. So risk analysis is just showing us these pictures, these visualizations of the expressions of risk that we've made. If I turn to the duration of the spend, the project part of this change program, I ask, what does that duration look like as a distribution? It looks a bit odd because of this. I have a risk, as well as the variance, the plus or minus, the 3-point estimate around the duration. I also have a risk of major technical issues, which has a 30% chance of happening. And if it does, it's going to cost me between 3 and 6 months delay. And so when I look at the distribution of the duration of that bar, it looks kind of weird. It's a melting together of my triangle, my 3-point estimate, plus this bit, which is when that risk occurs and costs us all those extra days. And I can look at that as a tornado, which shows me, so my P90 is about 200 days more than my base, and of that 200, most of it comes from my technical issues risk, and the rest of it comes from the 3-point estimate. And if we look at the amount of money the project's going to cost, what does that look like as a distribution? What's the P10, P50, P90 on that? This is really valuable information based on nothing more than this information on the right, our expressions of risk. So what that looks like is, what have I done? It's feeding back now. What that looks like is this, because it's a combination of 3 things now. It's a combination of that triangle, and that risk. And so it looks like this, P10, P50, P90, and the tornado, which show me what makes up those different deviations from my base assumption. And I'm going to skip through to show you what that looks like on profit. So that's really what we're interested in. What do all these expressions of risk do to my profit? And that's what it looks like. And again, you know, if my baseline profit was 40 million, my P90, almost worst case, is about 22 million. Why? Well, this tornado shows me why it could be so bad. And it's mostly due to the schedule variance of the benefits bar. Second biggest factor is that risk of major technical issues. This is doing nothing more than showing me the logical consequence of the risk assessments that I've made, both on the project part of the change program and of the benefits part of the change program. And very quickly, we can take this further. So we can look at the phasing of our money. So here is the phasing chart, or profit and loss. Well, this isn't quite profit and loss. This is just loss. This is just how quickly do we spend the money. The base is in grey, as always. And we're spending money until the project's finished. And we have our P10, P50, P90 case. And we can do the same thing for the benefits. That is us making money from zero, and we're making money at a steady rate until we finish. And again, a P10, P50, P90 version of those curves. Combine those together, look at the whole thing, we get our profit and loss curve. So again, the base is that in grey here, we're spending money steadily till we finish the project and we start making it back. And here's the point at which we break even and cross over the zero line, and we start really making profit after that point. But at P10, P90, very different picture. And this is nothing more than the logical conclusion of the risk assessments that we've made. And finally, we can turn all this into discounted phasing, so taking into account a discount rate. So for very long change programs, the one I did for ABP was over 10 years, I think 12 years. So the discount rate, you know, the time value of money starts to become important. Money we spend now is more costly than an equivalent amount of money we make back in 10 years' time. The money in 10 years' time isn't worth as much, and so we discount it in that way. And finally, this takes us to, well, second to finally, this takes us to an expression of NPV of the change program. This is net present value. This is like the holy grail. This is what is it worth, given how long it is, when the money is spent, when the money is made back, and all our expressions of risk around that. This is the value of this change program. So I started off by talking about change management being wider than project management, in the sense that we're not just looking at the project, but we're looking at why we're doing it. And this is very relevant to that. And finally, we can, oh no, I didn't, we can do it for internal rate of return. So in fact, ABP took this a step further, and they asked, what is my internal rate of return of this project? In other words, if instead of spending this, whatever many billion they were spending, we just put it in a bank, what interest rate would I want in that bank to make it as good an investment as putting it in a bank rather than spending the money? So their internal rate of return was something that was important to them, helped them ultimately justify the project. And they asked me ultimately to show them that as a probability distribution with a P10, P50, P90. And I'll say again, which was nothing more than the logical consequence, some maths to get there, but the logical consequence of the expressions of risk that they had made in the risk workshop. I'd love to take some questions and tell me what you think. Yes? So what software did I use to generate these graphs? I use a software that I'm involved in myself developing called Whitebox, which will be opposite of black box kind of thing. So trying to make it really transparent, and it's a play on my name as well. It will be available soon commercially to use. Thanks for that. Any other questions, or are you all just hungry? Or bored, or both? Yes?
Look, thanks very much for that, David Brennan. Is my name.
Welcome.
So, just going through it, the big thing is those risks, the percentages, because you can do whatever maths you want based on the numbers, but then the numbers are really important then, because whatever numbers you feed in are going to give you it out. So, like, how reliable? I suppose it's very difficult. Forecasting is very hard, and forecasting the risk. So you have a lot of experience, probably, I assume, over the last, maybe 20 years. And how reliable have you found, we'll say, the forecasts? Like, what's your experience of that?
Typically, people underestimate risk, and it's quite common for a project to blow the budget and even blow the P90 budget. And the reason for that is that people underestimate risk. It's quite difficult for people to think outside of the box of the base estimate that they've started with. And so when you run a risk workshop, there are techniques you can use to get people to kind of think outside of the box and entertain, really bad things that might happen that aren't really that unlikely to happen if you think about it. And so it's in the risk workshop that you try and get people to expand their mind and try and entertain the worst cases and also the best cases. And I would like to say just also that it's true that obviously you only get out what you put in. But if you make it transparent like these graphs show, where you're showing the overall contingency with an explanation of how we get there from that tornado, it becomes something that, although it's subjective and yes, garbage in, garbage out, it becomes something that you can put on someone's desk and say, this is our risk assessment. And if they say, well, that P90 is ridiculous, there's no way the project's going to go that badly, then you can say, well, it's mostly caused by this risk here at the top of this tornado, which we've assessed like this. So if you fundamentally disagree with the way we've assessed this risk, you think we've over-egged the probability or overestimated the impact, then you can see it very clearly and you can challenge it. So it becomes, I think, transparency and white box rather than black box is really important because it becomes something that people can own and challenge and ultimately agree on as being, this is our best representation of what's going to happen on this project that we possibly can come up with. So, thank you. Yes?
I'll just talk loud, shall I?
Oh, yeah. I'll repeat your question.
My question is that I noticed that you use almost benefit inside your assessment of risk.
Yeah.
And I think that's a bit of a culture change for me to think about combining them rather than having two separate ones, because we're not very good at capturing benefits.
Yeah.
So do you think that you mostly try to combine them?
Yes, I do.
Rather than have
Separate.
versus risk?
And the reason is, if you have two models, like a model for the spend part and then a model for the benefits part, I guess I'm talking just mathematically, you miss a lot. And what you miss is the correlation between the two things. So for example, if you have a risk to your project that delays the delivering of the benefits, then that does affect the benefits themselves. And if you represent it twice, one here and one here, you're missing the fact that it's actually the same thing. And lack of correlation or ignoring correlation in your modeling that exists in reality results in an underestimation of risk, actually. So you kind of miss out on a lot of the risk that really exists. I should say that not many of my customers do the benefits part. And like I said at the beginning, most of my work is just on the project part. I work for the project manager and the project team, and it's all about getting to the end. Who cares what happens after that? So I was really pleased that this customer is doing it, and I think as risk assessment and risk analysis becomes more clear and understood, more and more people will start to quantify their risk and look at it numerically and make good decisions. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.